planet's on fire. It's a real code red. Got us by the balls, we're being slowly bled. All the swollen puppet head propagandized. Big chocolate points, flat outlines. A house full of mirrors, it's a lousy reflection. Run hard left, it's a true direction. Democracy's in trouble, this news isn't fake. Everything we fought for is truly at stake. Border to border, coast to coast, it's time to cue the talent and meet our host. It's a podcast by George. All right, folks, it's showtime.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome on into another podcast by George. As always, thank you, Bob Pace, for that outstanding little jingle introduction that we have there on the show. This is a big one for me. I'm a real fan of Eleanor Goldfield. People know this. I've had her on the show before. I just love Eleanor Goldfield. And I hope you saw the promo for the show. Let me bring this up on screen so you can see this. A bloody shame. A deadly shame, folks. And it's in our name. We're going to be talking about GAZA with Eleanor and a lot of other things, and the propaganda of the day. You know, I promoted the show. I sent it out on Facebook, and I told people that I'm effed up. I'm FD'd up. And people, what do you mean you're FD'd up? What's that supposed to mean? Well, I'm frustrated and depressed, folks. I mean, this full frontal stuff, they're not even bothering to conceal what they're doing to us, what's happening to the world any longer. They're just doing it with or without our permission. The polls seem to indicate it's without our permission, and our political leaders are doing it anyway, killing thousands, hell, tens of thousands in the Middle East, millions of people, men, women, children, little bitty babies. And that's what's going on in Gaza. And it is in our name. But let me get to the live line introduction here for our guest, because I just love this. Eleanor Goldfield is a queer, creative, radical journalist and filmmaker. She works with a variety of independent outlets in both written and photojournalism. She is the co-founder of the independent media aggregate radindiemedia.com. It's one of the 2020 recipients of the Women and Media Award for Eleanor, presented by the Women's Institute for Freedom of the Press, and she's currently a board member of the Media Freedom Foundation. Her first documentary, Hard Road of Hope, check that out, folks, has garnered international praise as well as laurels from a dozen film festivals, all about Appalachia. I don't know what to say there. She recently released To the Trees. We talked about that the last time she was on the show. It's to sound the alarm from the treetops about big timber, which is helping to kill us all. And again, I want to blame these shadowy forces and the government and the corporations, but my God, we seem to be doing a pretty good job of killing ourselves, it looks like to me. We'll talk about that a little bit today. Currently, Eleanor is the co-host of the podcast Common Censored, along with Lee Camp, another hero of mine, as well as a co-host of the Project Censored radio show with Mickey Huff. And I've got the Project Censored book. I've had that up on the show before. Previously, she founded and fronted the political hard rock band Rooftop Revolutionaries, toured extensively, opening up for acts such as Tom Morello and Helmet. A couple of years ago, she released the No Solo EP in red vinyl. I've got it off to my left here. I might hold that up here during the show. And of course, I'm a proud owner of that. Her work is as a community organizer based on mutual aid principles and direct action. Okay, so, and here's the other little thing. We're going to be talking about climate, war, and healthcare, the big three on the PBG, but that is what we talk about, of course. Let me go over here, click that button, and click this button, and move that down there to where, there we go. There she is. Good morning, Eleanor Goldfield.
Morning. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, you know, that effed up thing, why I'm so frustrated and depressed. And I've never told you this story, but I've mentioned it on the show before. But, you know, I live here in Iowa, and in 2020, the Iowa caucuses, which I don't know how people in other parts of the country can bear that. I mean, I get sick of the Iowa caucuses myself, but I decided to, you know, do my duty and go to that thing. Went to the Democratic caucuses, and at the time I was caucusing for Tulsi Gabbard. Now, Tulsi had some good things going on back then, unlike now. She's completely changed. I don't know if she realizes that or not, but she has. But I was there to caucus for her. I was the one and only in my room caucusing for Tulsi Gabbard, Eleanor. And then, of course, when that doesn't work out, you got to move over to some other candidate. And so, I moved over to Bernie, and I didn't support him from the get-go because he'd collapsed in 2016, supported Hillary Clinton. I knew that he was going to do that again. And so I wasn't on board with Bernie. I wanted change, and that's why I kind of went with Tulsi. But I joined Bernie's group, and so they still needed more people. And they said, well, why don't you go over and get that person that's sitting in Biden's camp over there? And there was only very few, but Biden really lost the Iowa caucuses big time. And so okay, I'll go over there. And what am I going to say to him? Okay, I got a game changer. I mean, I got a deal maker here. I know what I'm going to say to him. So I went over and I talked to this Biden representative. Ends up they were like a party delegate or somebody. They were a Democratic Party operative. And I sat down with them and I said, we'd like for you to come over and join the Bernie group. And really, we could talk a lot, but I'll just put it in this one context, this one thing. I said, that Joe Biden on the Democratic side was one of the primary organizers, promoters, supporters of the Iraq War. You know that. Yeah, I know that. And that was a false pretense. That was a lie. Yep, I know that. That as many as 1 million innocent civilians died in Iraq, men, children, these little bitty babies that I talk about. You know that, right? And they said, yeah, I know that. So, okay, good. Now that I've made the deal, let's go over and join Bernie's folks. No, not going to do it. You're not going to do it? No. They're going to support Joe Biden. They're with the Democratic Party, and that's who they're going to support. And now for me, that was one of these kind of Rosetta Stones for me. It was one of those head snaps. It was like, I think I was aware of some of the shit that was going on, but that was kind of the beginning of it. And now here we are today. I was kind of slow on the uptake, I guess. I mean, I was kind of the naive K in this circumstance, because I think you were well aware of all this long before I was, Eleanor.
Well, I don't like to play the to play the game of, when at what point did we get to which point? And as Malcolm X said, there was a time when you didn't know what you know now, and we're always growing. As Nietzsche put it, we are not beings, we are becoming. And so, but yeah, I mean, when I was in high school, one of my favorite things to do, and a college counselor of mine, she said, if I had to give you one piece of advice, it would be to pick your fights, because I used to pick all of them because I went to a conservative school in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I used to argue with religious people, which is, I mean, it's dumb, because you're never going to convince someone who just believes in blind faith. But that's what the Democratic Party is. That's what these parties are. And I started to realize that as I got older as well, and which is why I don't dabble in electoralism. I know that it's an election year next year. I could give a shit, because nothing is going to, as Biden promised, nothing is going to fundamentally change. He said that during a speech to donors before he was quote unquote elected president. And so nothing fundamentally changes regardless of who is in the White House, largely regardless of who is in Congress, because Congress is also a sealed door to anybody who actually wants to fundamentally change the policy of the empire of the United States. And so electoralism to me is about as useful as arguing with somebody about whether God exists. If they believe that God exists, there's nothing that you could possibly say to change their mind. And so this is also why I think that it has to be something that comes from that person themselves. I can also liken it to addiction. You can sit down with somebody and talk to them about how their addiction is really harmful to themselves and others, but if they're not ready to hear it, it's not going to matter. So I think that that's also why I don't argue with people about whether they're Democrats or Republicans. Actually, I have to say that in the past, I've had better luck not arguing with just talking with people who vote Republican, actually, because Democrats have this feeling a lot of times that they are on the side of good, they are on the side of justice when they're not. But if you tell them that, it is like a deep, they take it as a deep harm. And so I actually have had better luck sitting down and talking to folks who have voted Republican. And I just don't argue with liberals anymore. It's just a colossal waste of time. And as one of my mentors, Kilu Nyasha, former Black Panther and badass organizer, once said, some folks are just going to die wrong. And that has to be okay. We have to let it go. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't try, right? It doesn't mean that we shouldn't do political education and community organizing, but some folks are going to die wrong, and that's just that.
Yeah, I made up this little list now. These reveals, these Rosetta Stones that I talk about on the show, in my lifetime, things that I'm so old that I can remember, and including the assassination of JFK, where the list kind of begins. But Vietnam, Watergate, the Pentagon Papers. My God, why didn't we figure out what was going on after that? Kent State, for God's sake, they shot down college students on their own campus.
But they actually did a poll after Kent State, and actually the majority of Americans actually believed that it was justified.
Yeah, my God. To continue this list, Iran-Contra, and I put down Iraq War, Syria, Nord Stream 2, of course. The Afghan Papers, again, the papers, kind of like the Pentagon Papers. Why the hell didn't we figure this out? Ukraine, and then this. Watch this. Everybody's kind of already forgotten this, Eleanor. I know you haven't. Here we go.
I never really thought that I would see and have confirmed pictures of terrorists beheading children. I never thought I'd ever. Anyway.
Yeah, and then he kind of trails off into whatever that is. But the point of that is, that's the current president of the United States in charge of the nuclear football. He can blow up the world 37 times over, and he's completely propagandized, completely wrong, standing in front of the American people and a television audience of some sort, saying that, my God, you can't do that. You can't be the president of the United States and do that. But again, everybody's kind of gotten this collective amnesia. And I love to show this on the show, Eleanor. I'm going to get you back in here. But this is cue Robert De Niro. This is what De Niro, and this is from the movie Casino.
Listen, if you didn't know you're being scammed, you're too fucking dumb to keep this job. If you didn't know you were in on it, either way, you're out. Get out. Go on. Let's go.
Yeah. I mean, that's the way I feel about Biden. Just that clip right there. And forget about the electoral politics part of it. I mean, somebody ought to get one of the hooks like they had off stage in vaudeville and take this guy away. You can't have that job if you do that. And he did.
I mean, to be honest, show me an American president who hasn't lied, particularly when it pertains to U.S. empire. I mean, yeah, Biden is disgusting, but Trump, Obama, Bush, Clinton. I mean, all of the presidents going back to the advent of the United States of America has been a liar and a war criminal. Even people's favorites, people love Lincoln. Well, he's responsible for the mass lynching of the most, the highest number of indigenous peoples at one time, the biggest mass state execution. So, I mean, there's no such thing as a legitimate hero for justice in the United States history of presidents or things like that. And that is very sobering, and it sucks to have that realization, but it's only by looking at things squarely that we can understand what we're up against. And this is also why I don't listen to Biden. Actually, every time that he speaks, I gag. But I don't listen to him speak. I don't listen to any of them speak, because what's the point? You're never going to hear anything important come out of their mouths, because let's say that they did say something important, like, for instance, when Obama said, Trayvon Martin could have been my son. That could have potentially been a beautiful moment. but policy didn't change. Black Lives Matter still started and forcefully grew under the Obama administration. So even when they do accidentally say something that could potentially be powerful or good, it doesn't actually change policy. And the powers that be very quickly make sure of that as well. So I think that, like if people want to watch C-SPAN, if you don't, if I recommend taking up knitting or something, but if you really want to watch these sacks of flesh spew propaganda, be my guest. But to me, it is completely useless, particularly when it comes to like the use of our time. The use of our time is much more better spent actually trying to organize to fight these things, because whatever these presidents say, whatever these members of Congress say, it doesn't change the U.S. empire. The U.S. empire is a well-oiled machine that continues to barrel forwards and protect itself, and we have to recognize that, and we have to reckon with that, regardless of which, if it's an election year or whether it's not an election year.
Well, that's well said. I can't say it any better than that. And they're doing great harm. These politicians are. I look at Biden. My jaw hit the floor when I saw, like, my God, man, you're going to get us all killed. I mean, what the hell is this? But of course, you could say that with just about any pronouncement that they make. Well, let me get going into the news of the day, because we brought on Eleanor to talk about GAZA. This is from Common Dreams. Now, I talked about Rad Indie Media, radindiemedia.com. Eleanor's behind that. This is where I go a lot of times to find articles, including postings about Common Dreams. And it reads, nightmarish situation as Israel resumes the assault on Gaza. Anything other than sustained peace and at-scale emergency aid will mean catastrophe for the children of Gaza, said a UNICEF spokesperson. Now, Israel resumed its assault on the Gaza Strip Friday morning, this morning, just minutes, like their ass was chapping to start blowing the shit out of Gaza again, folks, after the pause with Hamas that officially expired, ending a fragile 7-day truce that created conditions for the release of hundreds of Israeli and Palestinian captives and allowed additional but still inadequate humanitarian aid to enter the besieged territory. An investigation published yesterday by Plus 972 magazine and Local Call found that Israeli forces have used, now get this, expanded authorization for bombing non-military targets. Oh my God. And the loosening of constraints regarding expected civilian casualties, as well as an artificial intelligence system to generate more potential targets than ever to wage its devastating war on Gaza, killing more than 14,500 people in less than 2 months and displacing 70% of the territory's population. These might be some of the most obvious weasel words that I've ever read. They're going to continue to blow up Gaza and kill thousands of people. 14,500 killed. The people wounded are multiples of that. And of course, out of that 14,500, I'll put this into context. People just have no idea if you can do a visual on a stack of bodies like that. But think about the fact that 5,000 of those at least are kids. 5,000 U.S. soldiers are all that was killed during the Iraq War. That many kids, absolutely innocent, precious children, have been killed in Gaza. I'm going to get through this. I'm going to bring Eleanor back in. In one case, that anonymous Israeli sources described to the two outlets, Israel's military command knowingly approved the killing of hundreds of Palestinian civilians in an attempt to assassinate a single top Hamas military commander. Okay, I'm going to jump out of here at this point and bring you wonder why I get frustrated and depressed. I mean, that stuff just goes over the transom. People, it just goes by, Eleanor. But apparently, Israel is willing to kill tens of thousands of people just to kill a couple of Hamas leaders. That's what that says.
Well, but they don't actually care about Hamas. And actually, WikiLeaks released, I think it was like a week after October 7th or so, WikiLeaks, again, another reason why WikiLeaks is so important. WikiLeaks released images of cables that they had initially released in like 2007 or so that show that Israel knew about Hamas and actually wanted Hamas to grow, wanted Hamas to be a quote unquote a legitimate adversary, because then they could treat them as such. And even back in the 80s, there were cables between American diplomats talking about how Israel knew about Hamas and wanted Hamas to grow, to undermine PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And so this is like the idea that, I mean, Hamas is just like a dog whistle. People use it as, ironically, as a shield when talking about the terrorism and the horrific genocide that Israel is perpetuating. But Israel doesn't actually give a shit if it kills Hamas. It wants to kill everyone, so much to the point that it doesn't actually care if it kills its own hostages either. You know, Israel has been trying to silence the families who were actually protesting outside of Netanyahu's residence and the like, about how Israel's been handling this. But Israel doesn't give a shit about the families of the hostages or the hostages. I mean, Israel killed its own people on October 7th, and there is now a lot of documentation to support that. There's also documentation that came out today that suggests that Israel knew about October 7th a year or so before it even happened. So the idea that Israel is the victim in any of this is absurd. The only reason that Israelis died is because of apartheid Israel. So it's important to contextualize it in that way, because it's kind of like, if we can grieve the fact that, for instance, American soldiers died in Iraq, and I think that you should, but you also have to understand why they died. They didn't just die because Iraqis hate Americans. They died because we invaded their country. And it's the same context that is important with Israel and Palestine. Israeli civilians did die on October 7th. A lot of them were killed by the IDF.
Yes.
Or many people are calling it the IOF, the Israeli Offensive Forces, because Israel doesn't give a shit about human life. It cares about it is a white supremacist colonialist project. And so the idea that anybody's bombing or doing anything like that in order to kill Hamas, and oops, we just happened to kill babies in the process, that's bullshit. And it really, I mean, if you have any kind of intellectual capacity or even any humanity, then you will immediately recognize that as absolute dog shit. And you just have to look at what's happening. And I will say this: don't look away. There's a great outlet, electronic intifada, and a good friend of mine, Nora Barrows Friedman, just wrote a piece that is incredibly difficult to read, but it specifically talks about how Israel is targeting and purposely murdering babies, many of them premature babies who are born in Gaza. And this is fucking horrifying, but it's what's happening, and we can't look away. We have to be very, very clear about continuing to look at what's happening, and thereby understanding what's happening and calling it what it is: genocide. It is genocide by an apartheid, white supremacist, colonialist regime that is supported by the United States. And that's the other thing, is that people are like, oh my gosh, how could this be happening? How could this be happening? Like you said, minutes after this quote unquote pause ended, Israel gets to bomb the shit out of Gaza. Well, the US could make one phone call, literally one phone call, and the whole thing would end. And that's the other thing that I think is so important to understand, because a lot of times people feel like, oh, well, there's just nothing we can do about it. There is, particularly as Americans, as US citizens and residents. We, children of empire, have a responsibility and an opportunity to end the genocide in Gaza. And that means using whatever means we have to push our government. And this is not about electoralism. This doesn't mean vote for the person who's anti-genocide, because there aren't any main candidates who are. This means making it untenable, because if you look at the history of positive change in the United States, of which there is little, but if you look at that history, then it all happened because people pushed and it became untenable to do anything else. Yes. Everything from, women's right to vote, everything from the end of slavery to kids not working in mines anymore. It wasn't because some jackoff woke up in the morning and said, actually, you know what, I'm going to stop doing that thing. No, it's because people marched. They oftentimes took up arms. They blocked shit. They shut shit down. It is every single positive change has been because people made it untenable for the ruling powers to do anything but the thing that we demanded. So there is precedent. There is a history of this. We just have to engage in that history and understand that our power is that. And it is not about asking for them to do the thing. It's not about voting or begging or whatever the hell. It is about demanding and making it politically untenable to do anything but.
You know, I'm not a Middle East scholar, but Max Blumenthal is. And I think he was the first one that I heard talk about this. You mentioned it in passing, but those 1,500, and again, as to what the backdrop for this was, but those 1,500 civilians that were killed in Israel, a lot of those were killed by the IDF. And Max says it's because of this Hannibal military directive that the IDF has. Talk about that.
Well, so I'm not an expert on the Hannibal directive, but basically it's that, the Hannibal, the idea that we don't actually care if our civilians die in the perpetuation of Israel as an apartheid state, and as the original plans for Israel laid out, maximum land, minimum Palestinians. If you kill, 50 Palestinians and 10 Israelis, well, that's a good day. And it's the idea that Israeli citizens don't matter if their death can help push the narrative and push the goal. And that's exactly what we saw happen on October 7th. And you just have to look at the minimum amount of intellectualism and honesty. If you just look at the destruction of people and kibbutzes and things like that, Gaza does not, or like Palestinians don't have that military weaponry. So it's like they couldn't possibly create that devastation.
Yes.
Those are high level military weapons that Palestinians don't have access to. The only people that could create that kind of devastation is Israel. Apache helicopters and shit. Do you think Palestinians have Apache helicopters? No. So
Hellfire missiles. They found a lot of those victims in automobiles being taken back to Gaza, and they were melted.
Yeah.
Well, the Palestinians, they don't have any ability to do that type of thing. Israel does. Why? And this is about the graphic that I had, the deadly shame, the bloody shame. It's on our hands. We gave it to them. Those are, they say made in the USA on the side of them. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, how much credence do you give? Now, I have Brad Wolf with the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal on my show. I know that you're aware of those folks. And they really get at the fact that it's all about oil. So much of this is all about oil. What do you think as to why maybe this was launched right now? Gaza has a bunch of oil and gas right off of its shore that Israel / the United States wants. How much of a role does that play in this, do you think?
So I think it can play some role, but I think that if we take too much focus off of Israel as a white supremacist genocidal apartheid state, then we actually give them a pass. Like, oh, it's just about oil. It's not about this white supremacist Zionist ideology, but it is. So it's not like, in 1948, Zionists were like, and maybe there's oil. No, I mean, oil it's a nice plus. And obviously for the US, which relies on the petrodollar to perpetuate our existence as an empire, it's great news. But to suggest that that's why this is happening, I don't believe that. I think that, again, it can be part of it. But I dismiss the idea that is like the singular reason that this is happening. This is something that Israel has wanted to do for a long time. And people like Netanyahu have wanted to do for a long time. Ben-Gvir, same thing. It's like these people have wanted to create a genocide in Gaza for a long time. And they have been doing this, what they called mowing the grass, which is a disgusting way of putting it, but that's what they call it. Periodically going into Gaza and literally cutting people down and making sure that it was just, and this is another thing that WikiLeaks shared back in like 2008 or something, that things were just bad enough that it would keep the world and it would keep Gaza from collapsing entirely, but it was just at that level, right? And so this is something that they've wanted to do for a long time, which is again why they've allowed Hamas to exist. I mean, Gaza is the most surveilled place on the planet. It's not like they didn't know. And again, evidence to suggest that Israel knew that October 7th was going to happen. I mean, this is not a surprise to them. They wanted this to happen. And they wanted this to happen for the reason of colonialism and white supremacy. Now, again, the oil is a great plus, but I think when we suggest that that's the only reason, we let them off the hook because we make it sound like, oh, it's just a capitalist thing. But
Yeah.
no, it is very much the ideology of Zionism is it is connected to capitalism, but it is a very, very dark, twisted psychology that relies on white supremacist colonialism. And I don't think we should I really feel that we can't let go of that and just say that it's about, oil and gas.
You know, when this Gaza thing occurred and this wholesale slaughter of these innocent civilians in the thousands, and if it doesn't get stopped, it's going to be in the tens of thousands, and the innocent children and all that type of thing. I got to admit, I reeled in horror. I mean, I was kind of shaken. I tell people, you know, I knew that Jeffrey Dahmer exists, that John Wayne Gacy was out there. My God, I didn't know that there were millions of Americans supporting this type of thing, and that they're willing to take to the streets and rallies and all of this kind of, I mean, I was shocked. I really was. Were you, or are you way past that point?
I don't think I can get shocked anymore. I maintain that one should never lose the ability to be disgusted, but you soon will lose your ability to be shocked. I wasn't shocked because I've protested outside of AIPAC in DC, and I've had Zionists spit on me for being, not a real Jew, quote unquote, because I was protesting against AIPAC and against Israel as an apartheid state. So I'm not at all surprised. Just like one would not be shocked. Well, initially one is shocked to learn about World War II and what was going on in concentration camps. And of course, the question is always, how could this happen? How could people do that? Well, the term concentration camp actually originated in Cuba, where the Spanish were using concentration camps to force people on Cuba to live in them. And to be forced labor, slavery, the slave trade. I mean, we tend to think about atrocities as like this, like existing in a vacuum. And actually, there's a great book called "Exterminate All the Brutes" by Sven Lindqvist, who is a Swedish journalist, that talks about how we learn in the US and Europe as Hitler being this unique horror. But in reality, he grew up in a time when the Belgian Congo was happening, when Churchill was talking about the sport of shooting Africans at range because they couldn't defend themselves. I mean, this was the world that he was growing up in, and yet we consider him to be this unique horror. But there is a long history of people being this awful. And again, people being this awful in a colonialist way. And again, that is the very sick, twisted psychology of Zionism. It is the desire for Jews to be the oppressor as opposed to the oppressed. When in reality, if you look at Jewish teachings throughout history, it is all about us standing with the oppressed, never with the oppressor. But there was a small group, and I do say small group literally because there are actually more Christian Zionists in the United States than there are Jews worldwide.
I've heard that,
and
yeah.
Most Zionists are not Jews. Obviously, how could they be? Because there are not that many Jews. But so there was a small group of Jews who felt that this was their chance to be the oppressor, that this time that they could be the strong Jew. And it's not unusual for Jewish Zionists to talk about how Jews in concentration camps were the weak ones because they didn't stand up and defend themselves. I mean, there's a lot of sick, twisted shit that goes on with regards to Jewish Zionists in particular, but that is that psychology. And so it doesn't shock me at all because we have seen this throughout history. Any student of history can see this kind of thinking and this kind of twisted psychology repeat itself.
Yeah, twisted. How do we get that way? Propaganda, folks. And I mentioned at the onset when I did the bio for Eleanor, you look up multi-talented in the dictionary, you're going to see her picture, all these things that she does, including this little project here. I've got this banner up on screen. Eleanor does a weekly Project Censored show each week with Mickey Huff, and there's the projectcensored.org site. Go to that and check it out because, they're always talking about the propagandizing the media. And I thought of you and Mickey when I saw this article. Now, here's just one example. Honest to God, I can click on any news site and find this kind of stuff at this point. But this is from the Associated Press. Now, when I was doing the news back in the day, the AP and UPI, that was our go-to source. for world news in particular. And my God, could that be how we got to where we are today? Well, check this out. You'll see what I mean. AP, Putin accuses the West of trying to dismember and plunder Russia in a ranting speech. Let me read into this a little bit. These highlights are mine. You'll see what I'm talking about here. Russian President Vladimir Putin on Tuesday of this week in a ranting speech. Oh, wait a minute. That's editorializing. What kind of speech? Good speeches, most of them are ranting. What the hell does that mean? That's an extremely negative portrayal of a speech. Okay, well, they just throw this in there. It's conditioning. It's propagandizing before a presidential election campaign. My God, a ranting. What are you going to criticize a guy for making a ranting speech before a presidential election campaign? Now, I'm no Putin fan, but that's not the point of this. Cast Moscow's military action in Ukraine as an existential battle against purported attempts by the West to destroy Russia. Well, man, you can go from here to the hereafter and find all kinds of people that support that point of view in the West and around the world. Now, Putin, who's been in power for more than 2 decades, and that I highlighted that, Eleanor, because I still hear from people that say, well, they got to overthrow Putin. I mean, they got to hell, this guy's extremely popular in his country. He's going to be reelected. He's the longest serving Russian leader since Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, expected to soon declare his intention to seek, another 6-year term in a presidential election next March. He denounced what he described as Western Russophobia, claiming that our diversity and unity of cultures, traditions, languages, and ethnic groups simply don't fit into the logic of Western racists and colonialists, into their cruel scheme of total depersonalization, disunity, suppression, and exploitation. Okay, so here's the last paragraph I'm going to read, and this highlighting is mine. If they can't do it by force, they'll try to sow strife, he said, vowing to block any outside interference, provocations with the aim of causing inter-ethnic or inter-religious conflicts as aggressive actions against our country as an attempt to once again foment terrorism and extremism in Russia as a tool to fight us. Well, that wasn't the paragraph. Okay, here it is. Russian authorities have intensified their crackdown on dissent amid the fighting in Ukraine, arresting and imprisoning protesters and activists and silencing independent news outlets. Okay, so they put this in there so that we get this real negative feeling about how horrific the circumstances are in Russia. Eleanor, I read that and I thought of Julian Assange. I thought of the protesters that have been arrested in this country, and of course the silencing of independent news outlets to criticize Russia. I mean, that's laugh out loud funny, but this is what I'm talking about, is propagandizing America.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's one of the things that we do at Project Censored is we talk about media literacy, and it's the ability to recognize how you're being lied to, and the language that they use. And I will say this, I think, like you said, I think it's important to note that one can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? I don't like Putin. It's not like we wouldn't be friends. And at the same time, I totally recognize what the U.S. is doing vis-a-vis Ukraine. And I can't remember who said it, but fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian, basically sacrificing Ukrainian civilians for the sake of poking the Russian bear. And Putin's very clear about that too. And and so I think, with regards, and, of course, they're trying to compare him to Stalin with that commentary. And we can talk about whether he's popular or not. I know that there are a lot of people who have been out protesting against Putin and things like that. I'm also not an expert on Russian politics. I'm a Swedish American, so that's not my area of focus. And as an American, as a Swedish person as well, my lane is not to comment on how the Russians vote or anything like that. That's not my lane. Just like I feel like it's not my lane to tell the Venezuelans how they should vote, or to, tell people in Chile or anywhere else how to vote. My lane is to try and ensure that the U.S. doesn't mess with them as they try to cast their votes, which is, of course, this is the projecting that U.S. media does as well. We're the ones who interfere in international elections. We are the ones who silence journalists and media outlets. Now, whether that happens in Russia as well is not really the point. The point is that we are creating, have created for a long time, this boogeyman of Russia, just like we're doing now with China. You know, people post all kinds of bullshit like, oh, well, I'm not going to, China's doing this and China's doing that. I'm like, do you know what your government is doing? Like, who gives a shit?
Yes.
Like, focus, stay in your lane. And that is the other thing, is that we as Americans have been taught that the US is perfect. Just let it be. If there are problems with the US, it's because somebody else is creating that problem. It's the Russians, it's the Chinese, it's the, it's those Muslims. It's the, it's all the people migrating from the South. It's like, there is just an endless stream of scapegoats that have nothing to do with our government, because that's, of course, the point. They want to make sure that you're not looking at your own government, but you're blaming somebody else, as if Putin could give a flying fuck whether it's Hillary Clinton or Trump. I mean, Trump was actually harder on Russia than his predecessor, than Obama. And people love to, point that like, oh, Trump was elected because, no, that's BS. It's been proven wrong over and over and over again. But yeah, I mean, the importance of media literacy is really that, like, the critical ability to look at any kind of article. And I'm not just saying like AP. One should look at this in leftist outlets as well, to try and see if they're trying to get one by you. Use media literacy all the time, and because there's no such thing as objective news, right? There's always subjectivity. We are not objective beings, so you have to use that lens. And if you don't, then you just can't. You just don't have a legitimate perspective on what's really going on in the world.
Eleanor, we do coups in this country. A lot of people would disagree with that. Oh, the United States wouldn't coup another. Oh my God, John Bolton. And I had Misty Winston on my show. She was the first one to use this term. I don't know where it came from. She calls John Bolton the death walrus, which still makes me laugh. But my God, he came out, the death walrus did. And he was criticizing Trump or somebody for a failed coup effort, or talking about coups. And John Bolton says, I know about coups. I've done coups.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wait a minute. You're not supposed to say that, dude. But he did in a moment of weak reasoning. Okay, so we're talking about this bias in reporting. Let me bring this up on screen. This is, again, going back to Gaza here. I wanted Eleanor to comment on this. A scramble is on for the extension of the truce. 3 Israeli captives killed in bombing, Hamas says, on a day when Hamas released 16 more hostages. Now, Hamas releases 16 hostages. Negotiators from at least 5 countries, was the United States among those 5 countries, were working feverishly Wednesday. Again, it's all about the words, folks. Every word means something. I'm reading this in the USA Today, and I'm going, what in the hell? But that's an easy one. Eleanor, talk about the difference between a captive, a hostage, and a prisoner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, this was, I can't remember where I read this, but it was, there were Israeli hostages, including some children, were released, and there were Palestinian prisoners, some under the age of 18. Well, that's a kid, isn't it? Yeah. But you can't say the word, right? Mm-hmm. And so the difference is, and we do this with everything, right? Like, it's the Maduro regime. Even though President Maduro of Venezuela was democratically elected in some of the most democratic elections in the world, we don't call it the Macron regime, do we? Even though he's barely holding on to power with continued protests against his regime. You don't call it the Biden regime, do you? Even though, I mean, I would. So it's the way that these words kind of flow past, and the way that you process them is that you end up thinking, oh, prisoners have done something wrong, right? Hostages are these poor innocent people who get stuck in a fray. And that's the other thing. It makes you think that this is an even match. It's a war, right? Which is another euphemism for genocide. It's not a war, because a war suggests that there might be like some kind of evenly matched sides, which of course there aren't. And prisoners, I mean, there are thousands of children in prison in Israel, yes, just for being Palestinian. I mean, there was literally video the other day of IDF kidnapping a 2-year-old, a 2-year-old child. You look me in the fucking eye, people, and tell me that that is a terrorist. And if you do, there aren't words for what I hope happens to you, because you are just the shittiest human being on this planet. But there are people that believe that. And again, this is why I don't argue with those people, because I don't have enough life. And it is a waste of life for me to try to talk to someone who honestly believes that the IDF should be kidnapping 2-year-olds. And so, but this is what happens every day. This is daily life, right? And I think that's the other thing, is that people think, oh, on October 7th, this shit went down. No. This has been going on. Oh, let me check my watch. 75 years. So the idea that this is just new, no. Of course, the genocide is happening now, where literally more people have been displaced and murdered than happened in the original Nakba in 1948. So yes, I'm not saying that there isn't a ramping up, but to suggest that this all just started on October 7th is bullshit. And we have evidence from years and years of horrific terrorism vis-a-vis Israel perpetuating this violence on Gaza and on, the West Bank and Palestinians in general. So this is not new. This didn't just happen. And so these are the children that are still, by the way, in prison. And it actually, I can't remember which outlet it was, but the same day that Israel released these hostages, because that's what they are, they immediately kidnapped about that many. So it was like 116 or something, and they kidnapped like 114 more. So I mean, again, like, and there's no way for the Palestinians to fight back. Just the simple fact that there are Israeli hostages is like breaking news, because it's so impossible for the Palestinians to fight back in any kind of way that would meet that level of violence. So Israel just does whatever it wants, and we see that with the ramping up of violence this morning after the quote unquote pause, which was basically meaningless. So yeah, I mean, this is this language is done on purpose to get people to try and think of the Palestinians as not human, and that's of course why you're not going to see pictures of the babies outside of incubators that Israel murdered, because while you might be able to twist your mind to accept that, a 16-year-old boy should have both, or he was like 12, both of his arms broken by Israeli forces, the idea of pulling babies out of incubators and letting them die because Israel has a right to defend itself, that is a stretch too far for most people, which is why you're never going to see that shit on mainstream and corporate media in the United States.
Yeah, you can seek it out. I did see it. It's on online, folks, and it's not just hyperbole. I mean, it's out there. It's real. Now, the other thing that you mentioned, and it works, because here's what I thought. I thought, well, okay, and I read Chris Hedges early on, and he said, you put a bunch of people in a pen, you treat them like that, and they're going to respond this way. That made sense to me, and I thought, my God, it's like you got pit bulls in a pen, and you beat them, and then they bite you, and you complain about it. But then again, I heard Blumenthal. Now, here's what he said. He said that those prisoners that you're talking about that are being held illegally without redress in those Israeli jails for years, oftentimes, the Palestinians have been trying to get those people out. They've been going through appropriate channels. They've been making appeals to everybody from the UN to the US to Israel itself to get those people out, because they're being held for nothing illegally. They had no success. Nobody would listen to them. And I thought, well, they just, lost it, ran out of Gaza, went into Israel and killed everybody they saw in response to retaliate. Blumenthal said, no, they were going in there to get prisoners, to get hostages for a prisoner exchange. That's really what they were trying to do, was go in there and kill people. Don't get me wrong. I mean, that was part of it too, but they needed to have something to exchange, basically. So they went in there to get prisoners. Do you think that's accurate?
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, Max Blumenthal knows far more about this topic than I do. I mean, he's written entire books about it.
Goliath, yeah.
And so I'm not going to speculate on that specifically, but I will say this, that Palestinians have tried basically since 1948 to go through the quote unquote proper channels to beg and plead. I mean, look at the Great March of Return. They literally just walked. They walked, some with keys in their hands for homes that were stolen, and they were murdered. There was there were continuous massacres of children, of elders, of press, of medics. And and then the whole world was like, yeah, that's a bummer. And then I ask you, if you watched your child be murdered in front of your eyes, if you watched your sister, your brother, your mother be murdered, would you go home and be like, well, that's just how it is. Israel has a right to defend itself? No, I'm telling you right now, I would join any kind of organization that would promise that we would fight for justice. I mean, and if you look at actually, if you look at the people who started Hamas, if you look at the people who are a part of Hamas, there's not one of them that has not had a family member murdered by Israel. People don't join these. And it's the same thing if you look at like resistance fighters in Iraq, Syria, whatever. People don't join this because they don't have anything to do on a Saturday afternoon. They join these kind of organizations, these militant resistance organizations, because they are being murdered. They are being genocided. So, and this is not about whether you want to sit and talk about, well, if that's the approach, I don't think that's the appropriate way to, I don't give a shit. And we don't have the right to tell people how to resist a genocide. And we don't have the right to tell people how to resist apartheid. That is not our place. It's not your place unless you're living it. And so you just have to understand this context and look at what Israel has done and understand, what would you do in that situation? Ask yourself what you would do if you held your child in your arms and watched them die. What would you do?
Yes.
And so this is, and this is that complete lack of empathy that gets just turned off when people talk about this issue. And again, it's why I don't argue with some people about it, because there's no point. I just end up screaming into an anechoic chamber. And so I think that is the first thing to recognize, but also to recognize that Palestinians have tried all of it. Look at the BDS movement. Okay, let's boycott. Let's peacefully march. Let's do all of the things. There is nothing that the Palestinians can do that is acceptable, because they are unacceptable in the eyes of Israel and their allies, because their existence stands in the way of Israel's ability to be the complete owner of that space. And so it's the same thing if you look at the history of resistance, indigenous resistance in the so-called United States. Anything they did, including dancing, was considered inappropriate and unacceptable because it stood in the way of Western expansion and the hegemony of the United States and manifest destiny. So there is no acceptable way for indigenous peoples to resist. And so this then again begs the question, what do you do to try and seek justice and liberation?
Yeah, we're going to run out of time here very shortly, but I wanted to bring this up on screen. Now, this is from another friend of Eleanor's. This is Matthew Ho. I follow his Twitter feed, and this kind of sums it up visually. She said, look, the wall can't truly be understood unless you've experienced it. It defines and dominates everything for Palestinians and Israelis. Now, that's for people that are watching in video here, kind of small, but look at those two kids. Look at their side of the fence. Look at the beginnings of what they have here. And I don't know if this was before the current crush is concerned. Then look over the fence and look what's over there. I mean, that's a great photo. That really sums it up, Eleanor.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is I myself have not been to Palestine, but most of my friends have. And what they say is that basically, like, if you ever have gone into Gaza, if you can make it into Gaza, which most can't, on purpose, right? Because Israel doesn't want people to see what's actually going on in there. There's no way that you could hold any kind of respect or understanding for what Israel does. There's absolutely no way, unless you're like a true psychopath, because it is absolutely horrific what is going on in there. And when I think when people get uncomfortable, rightfully so, you should be uncomfortable with comparisons to Nazi Germany. And I'm like, yeah, you should feel uncomfortable because it's true. If you don't want to be compared to a Nazi, don't act like one. And I think, again, like, these comparisons, particularly for people in the Jewish community, make us bristle. And they should. They absolutely should. And that is why you see organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now, and things like that, making sure that we make that distinction between Zionism and Judaism and anti-Semitism, which, by the way, the Palestinians are Semites. If you could, I mean, just Google it, folks. I mean, Jesus Christ, it's not that difficult. Palestinians are Semites. So really anti-Semitic is Israel. Israel is an anti-Semitic state, not just with regards to Palestinians, but also to Jews. Lest we forget that Israel is responsible for forcibly sterilizing Ethiopian Jews because they're Black. Again, a white supremacist, colonialist, settler colonialist state. That is what Israel is. And so the images like the one that you just shared, there's no shortage of these images. And I tell people, don't look away. Go to places like the Electronic Intifada. Go to follow Palestinian organizations and Palestinian journalists who are being murdered because they dare tell the story of their people and their home place. Find these people, uplift these stories, because the only way that we can get more people to understand what's really going on and what is being perpetuated by the United States empire.
Yeah, the bloody shame, the blood on our hands, folks. Well, I'm going to turn the rest of these into quick hitters here. I wanted to get a couple of reacts from Eleanor on these types of things. Here he is. He's gone, finally. My God, like the Emperor from Star Wars. I mean, when was this guy going to die? Well, he did. Henry Kissinger, war criminal, beloved by America's ruling class, finally dies. This kind of jumped out at me because Rolling Stone used to be independent media. I mean, that's where the great Matt Taibbi came from. Dr. Hunter S. Thompson. I used to read those guys back in the day. And Rolling Stone, fell in line with the Democratic Party and Joe Biden here a few years ago, and they ain't what they used to be. But I thought I kind of did a head snap here, Eleanor. It says, good riddance. The highlighting here is mine. The infamy of Nixon's foreign policy architect sits eternally beside that of history's worst mass murderers. A deeper shame attaches to the country that celebrates him. Yeah, man, there is no doubt about it. Although I will say, every time that I see something like this, Eleanor, I always think about Iraq. A million dead people. Brown University says if you do the extension on that around the Middle East as a result of 9/11, as many as 5 million civilians could be dead over there. Yeah, Kissinger was horrific and illegally expanded or helped expand that war into Cambodia and all that type of thing. But I don't know who's worse. And maybe when you're measuring mass killers, it doesn't make any difference. So,
well, I mean, Kissinger was unique. And also, this is something that folks don't talk about, but Lee Camp has talked about this quite a bit. Kissinger was the one who came up with a petrodollar, which is arguably why the U.S. empire and therefore the globe is in the situation that is in right now. Because, of course, the petrodollar means that goods are traded in the dollar, right? Because of oil and gas. So Saudi Arabia, for instance, uses the petrodollar, and that deal was created by Kissinger. And this means that the U.S. has a tremendous amount of security with regards to its economy, because people around the world have to use the dollar. And this is why we can't shift to green energy, because of the petrodollar. So Kissinger is not only a war criminal, but he is an architect of climate chaos, and people don't talk about that. And this is what, so, and again, like I've never been so eager to dance on someone's grave. But I mean, this guy, like, yes, Cambodia, Laos, like, absolutely, but also an architect of climate chaos because of what he created with the petrodollar. And just one little tidbit, because Katie Halper actually shared this, which I mean, like I needed another reason to hate Kissinger, but this is Henry Kissinger quote: "If it were not for the accident of my birth, I would be anti-Semitic." And he added, quote, "Any people who has been persecuted for 2,000 years must be doing something wrong."
Oh my God.
So this guy who the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, and like, all of these, like Zionists of America and all this shit are being like, oh my gosh, this is the perfect Jew. It's like, dude was a self-hating Jew. And it's like, you have the fucking spine to tell me that I'm a self-hating Jew. This guy literally was like, I hate Jews. I just happen to be one. It's a bummer. Like, this guy was horrific from the very like personal, of course, to the global. So it's like, in case you needed another reason to hate Kissinger, there you go. That's my gift to you.
Oh God. And Eleanor mentioned Lee Camp. Now, I'm a big fan, and particularly this book, bullets and bullet points and punchlines. And I want to read this just maybe to take us out here because this is funny stuff, but it's great. And Lee puts this all in context. He talks about the Vietnam War. Again, Henry Kissinger is in blood up to his elbows regarding that. He says, sure, most everyone knows the catastrophic Vietnam War was precipitated by the Gulf of Tonkin incident in which U.S. naval vessels were fired upon by villainous North Vietnamese torpedo boats. That's what we were told, folks. Following that skirmish, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara recommended that President Johnson retaliate, and the full force Vietnam War began. But most Americans still don't know that there was no Gulf of Tonkin incident unless you count U.S. naval ships literally firing their weapons at weather events they saw on the radar. The 2003 documentary, The Fog of War, finally revealed the truth. Former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara confessed that the Gulf of Tonkin attack did not actually happen. And I would also say McNamara went on to say that when it came to the domino theory, the other thing that we were told with the Vietnam War, again, Kissinger in blood up to his neck on that thing, he was wrong. McNamara got old, he got feeble, he got ready to meet St. Peter at the pearly gates, and he fessed up on all of this kind of stuff. Now here's what Lee says. That's right. It never happened. The highlighting is mine. Much like leprechauns or dragons or Simon Cowell's talent, it was a figment of our national imagination. The lies of our government, followed by the fawning, credulous reporting from our media, led to the death of 58,000 U.S. service members and as many as 3.8 million Vietnamese. My God, try to get a visual on that. The United States government has one of the most powerful departments of fabrication and falsification ever assembled. It's a modern marvel on par with the Great Pyramid and Ralph Nadal's down the line running forehand. Okay, we got to leave it there because we're out of time. But I cite that book and Lee's stuff all the time on the show. I love having him. I love having you on, Eleanor, to talk about this. And you've got a special connection with the situation in Israel, and you've been on the front line working this issue for many years. We're out of time here. I just want to give you a last word, kind of give us a wrap up here. And man, I'm going to get you back on very soon because I love me some Eleanor Goldfield. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, thanks so much for having me, George.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I just say, do continue to uplift this issue. I think it's important. Like, don't stop talking about Palestine. Don't stop forcing people to look at what's happening there and making the connection to our fights here. So again, I recommend Electronic Intifada. You know, Project Censored we've been doing a lot of pieces about it. Of course, my work with Lee Camp, we've been talking about it as well. But it is important to not stop talking about it and to not let it fade.
Oh, that's great. Well, it brightens my day, and it's just love talking to Eleanor. Like I said, because I am FD'd, I am effed up, folks. I am frustrated and depressed. For one reason, I'm getting old. I'm getting on. I would like to think that we're going to get this changed. We're going to get this thing turned around. But my God, we're going in the other direction, and so quickly. It is so shocking and depressing. And my God, it's good to talk to Eleanor Goldfield and get the real deal. We'll talk again very soon, Eleanor.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on here. And I'm going to take her away, and we'll bring her back here very soon and mention at the end, like I always do, that if you like podcasts by George and you like seeing folks like Eleanor Goldfield and you like hearing from people that have been correct right down the line for years about every major issue of our time, that's who Eleanor Goldfield is. You like seeing that? Go to podcastbygeorge.com and sign up for these video streams. You can do that on Facebook and on YouTube. And then for the audio versions here, the audio podcast, the platforms for those are there as well. You can sign up, subscribe on, YouTube and iTunes and Spotify and all those kinds of places. And always, like I say, give us a thumbs up, give us a recommendation, and share the show with friends so that it gets out and about. But that's going to do it, folks. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is. And there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.